Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Robertson. I'm the Assistant Dean of Students here at WVU Tech. And I want to thank you for attending today's Gender Talk session with Dr. Andi Kent. And I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Kent.
So yeah, this is a talk about language for a gender diverse world. And for a lot of you, this will be very new, but this is not a new concept overall. But the language does change. And so part of what I want to do with this talk is give you some indication of what this changed language looks like. I click my word literally a second. There we go. All right, so three main things that I hope to get through today. One is to talk about the importance of language as a whole, but also the mutability and the changeability of language. Current terms in gender diversity, there are a lot of them. I'm going to cover a lot of different things. I have given Scott a PDF copy of the slides here that for those of you on Zoom, he will post in the chat, and we can maybe figure out a way to make sure that those of you here in person can get a copy of those too. So thank you very much. This is the big no-no of slides in a lecture, right? Is having too much text on the slides. There's going to be a lot here. I'm not expecting you to absorb it all. But I want to be able to touch on as many of these topics as possible. And I'm going to end with some tips, some best practices for how we can be more gender inclusive on campus and in our classrooms, as well as providing you with a whole host of resources if you've got sort of a additional reading or additional learning you want to do there. So just to start things off though, a couple of sort of formulative ideas to get us all on the same page and open to understanding what we're doing here. So gender and sexual variance is not the norm in society, not the majority, but it is completely normal here. People may identify a certain way today, but that can change. We know that both sexuality and gender identity are fluid. They can shift over time, in part because of learning things like language to be able to talk about your experiences in the real world, and in part just because we as people change over time here. Change does not mean that someone was lying to you before or that their previous existence was invalid there. This is one of the big things that we see coming up. No, it doesn't mean that there's something untrue about the past here. You might have really strong opinions about gender and sexuality. If you're in this talk, you're at least open to learning something here. But the overall message is you do not get to define someone else's reality. So just because those are your feelings do not mean that there are somebody else's there. And we need to be open to hearing what other people have to say. You may have a lot of questions. This is a safe place to ask those questions. I am putting myself out there as someone you can talk to. I'm sure Scott would be willing to answer your questions, but nobody owes you an explanation here, especially strangers. So if someone says, I want to use they, them pronouns, there's not follow-up questions there. They don't owe you the story of why that is true. You just use the pronouns that they ask you to use there. If it's someone close to you, there may be exceptions, but definitely not our students, not members of your club. It is what they say it is there. And you may be cisgender and straight. Hopefully these are terms that you've heard before. If not, you'll come up to them today. Most people are. Again, this is not the norm here. But that doesn't mean you can't be an ally to those who are not. And so hopefully through some of this language, you'll be able to wade into the discussions that are going on across the country and around the world here about gender identity and sexual orientation is sort of a side note here. So culture shapes language, language shapes culture. Just because we don't use the terms that we use today to talk about gender nonconforming, transgender people, and so on, does not mean that this is a new thing that we're just making up as the words come up. People have existed forever here, but some cultures are less amenable to gender diversity and to diversity with regards to sexual orientation. Particularly Western culture, particularly Christian culture, has very strict views on man, woman. Those are the only two things. This is what that means. And that has influenced then the language that we use within our society to talk about gender and sexuality. Normativity is the concept that says what is expected in society? What is the dominant ideology or the dominant thought process in society? And those are people that actually study language. I'm a political scientist, not an English person. So we talk about power a lot in political science. Language has power, and the dominant narratives in society have power here. And so cis-normative having to do with gender and heteronormative having to do with sexuality cements the dominant ideas within society. We expect this to be the norm because that's what we talk about. And again, language can open that up and can crack that shell in a way. There is increasing but incremental acceptance of difference in these areas. And again, language helps us to create spaces to talk about that. Language plays a whole bunch of really important roles. And again, in political science, when we talk about taking people's rights away, the way you do that is to lessen people. And language helps us to elevate and keep people on a standard here. So it legitimizes, it humanizes an experience. It can, I've got illuminate and validate on here. It can tell you something and give you words to describe experiences that you didn't have before there. And ultimately, it then creates space in which to have the discussion and to understand what is happening and again, legitimize people's identities here. Language evolves. And so just an initial crash course in the language here about how terms have changed over time here. Transgender is how we refer to someone who does not identify with their biological sex. And you can see the words that I have crossed out here. Those are now outdated. Take those out of your vocabulary. Transgender is the word that we currently use. That may change in time here. There's no reason this will be fixed either. But those other ones are in the past. Just as a note here, never transgendered. Transgender isn't something that happens to you or something that you leave in the past. You are just transgender. Again, intersex is now the term that we use here for people who don't fall specifically into the biological categories of male or female at birth. We have new and sort of reimagined words to again expand and talk about these experiences. So cisgender is the antithesis to transgender. Trans is going across something, cis is on your side of something in the Latin roots. So in 2016, these words up on the top here all made the dictionary, which is like the creme de la creme standard of language now exists officially here. So cisgender, gender, queer, gender fluid, and mix, MX here, pronounced mix, is the alternative to Mr. MR dot or Ms. MS dot. Mix is a gender neutral way to address that. Asexual makes the dictionary in 2017. They, so pronouns are a big part of the discussion of inclusivity with regards to gender. A gender neutral they pronoun first made the Oxford Dictionary in 1998 and makes it to Merriam-Webster, which is the big one in the States, in 2019. So again, putting these words and mainstreaming them, giving them the official dictionary stamp of approval here, that for those of you who are professors, your students like to start papers with. According to Merriam-Webster, this is what it says. These are the official terms here. There's also an evolution of language that happens when you reclaim terms that have been used as slurs or been used negatively against the community in the past. So queer is a big one in the LGBTQ community. The Q at the end of LGBTQ can stand for questioning, but it's predominantly stands for queer. There was honestly a lot of talk a couple years ago about whether or not to add the Q there, because there are still a lot of people who do not like queer, even LGBTQ folks who said that this was what was hurled at me over and over again. And I would note with this, unless someone calls themselves queer and identifies as queer, I would not put that label on them. This is something that you should take your cue from people here. This is very much still an in-group self-identification kind of thing. But there are programs, you can get degrees in queer studies now, and this is not a term that we would have ever imagined or a degree that we ever would have thought would have happened 25 years ago here. So again, language changes, language evolves. The other big change, sort of meta change that we've seen about language with regards to LGBTQ folks in general and other minority communities has been the recentering and reasserting of personhood. These are adjectives. These are not nouns. So person is not a transgender. You're a transgender person. here, a trans man, a trans woman, whatever the person piece you want to add there. So again, we're centering personhood within this language. So again, when you're using this, be sure to use these as adjectives here. And why is this such a big deal in the first place? Why learn about some language? What we're seeing is changing demographics. So again, those of you that are faculty or staff in this meeting, thank you for coming out. This is delightful. A lot of the young people coming into our universities identify as LGBTQ here. They identify with this variance. And so I've got two different polls that have come out of a most recent Gallup poll survey, which again, I always tell my students is a good, reliable survey, give you good information here. But as you can see, 16%, 1 in 6 Gen Z people identify somewhere in the LGBTQ spectrum. And when you look at sort of the breakdown then of which identities are chosen here, you can see transgender in particular here is still a very small portion of the LGBTQ community, but it is a rapidly growing one. For those of us that, okay, I'm a millennial, so I'm still towards the top here, but those of you that are the Gen X, the baby boomers sort of generation here, there's a lot more visibility. There are a lot more out people now in the future generations than there were in the past. Lots of debate about why this happens, but for the most part, the conclusion is it's a safety thing, that it's more common. You're not as likely to experience violence, although violence against LGBTQ folks, homelessness for LGBTQ youth is still a very real thing. But the numbers are there, and so we need to be aware of how to interact with this. And with regards to gender specifically, again, times are changing here. So this is another recent poll that was come out on the right-hand side of your screen there that asked the question, are traditional gender roles outdated? And again, Gen Z and Gen Y, the millennial generation, 50% or more say that this gender binary sort of expectations are outdated here. And the bigger picture here with the pie chart was done by the Trevor Project on LGBTQ youth, and a quarter, 1 in 4 Gen Z LGBTQ kids use some variation of pronouns, predominantly using they, them pronouns, but also using some of the other, what we call neo pronouns. And I'll give you again a big list. I have to look these up because there's so many that are coming out here. But they, them, there is by far the most common set of non-binary pronouns. But again, so this is a noticeable chunk. And so it's incredibly likely that we will encounter students, we will encounter people in our communities who use these. And so again, I want to give you that language. The other big reason why you should learn this language is that there are huge fights going on right now about transgender and LGBTQ rights. Transgender folks are in particular have borne the brunt of this, but again, coming from the poli-sci field, politics matter. We all live in a society that is defined ultimately by politics. And it depends on who's in power, what sort of rights we see happening here. So there's been just a night and day change between the Trump administration and the Biden administration at the federal level there. But as we're seeing, state and local politics matter a tremendous amount. The overall trends have been ultimately that we've seen an expansion of protections at the federal level, at the national level, with regards to sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's been sort of a newer thing to add the and gender identity piece to these protections. But there's a huge onslaught of state level laws restricting, particularly transgender rights today. So you've got sort of the federal level and the state level. I have on the left-hand side here, the diversity statement from the WVU. And WVU does in their diversity statement recognize, you can tell a whole bunch of things here. I mean, it's like 7 or 8 lines of different things that we're going to be sure not to discriminate against people on. But for the purposes here, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are all included in this statement. So at the national level, a couple of things that are coming up, non-discrimination ordinances, things that say you cannot discriminate against someone. Again, Beckley passed one of these not too long ago. So at the local level, this happens as well. But there's expanded legal protections, gender neutral accommodations, gender neutral IDs is sort of the big forefront right now in a push with the Biden administration, and his administration seems amenable to this. But should passports need to have your sex on there? Or should you have at least an option besides male and female on those? That's becoming more common. And there was a really big court case that came out this last summer, expanding protections in law to more and more people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And basically it came down to a very sort of simple conclusion, and that is if you are discriminating against someone on the basis of who they're attracted to or who the gender of the person they're attracted to or the gender that they present with, you're discriminating on sex. And it was actually a fairly cleverly worded decision in that they didn't bother trying to define sex. They just said, whatever your definition is, if you are discriminating on these factors, it's got to be about sex. And it doesn't matter what that is. Again, at the state level, we're seeing a huge number of laws restricting trans rights. There's one before the Senate right now. Actually, there's two before the Senate in West Virginia right now. They have passed the House. More than 100 bills in more than 30 states. This is not a new thing really since 2015. Every year there's been this glut of anti-trans laws, but the big ones this year, and the reason they stand out is because they're really targeting trans youth. For the first time, this is really where the sights have fallen. And so Arkansas has just passed, and it's on the governor's desk to sign, a bill that will criminalize healthcare for trans youth. But no matter what the child, the parents, or the doctors say, it will be a felony to provide gender affirming healthcare to trans youth, and that is highly likely to pass there. He will almost assuredly sign that. The other big one is excluding trans youth, particularly trans girls, from sports. And so there are all kinds of places that you can find information on this. This is the Freedom for All Americans legislative tracker. It had a pretty map, so that's why I put it on here. But you can see that a lot of states here have anti-trans bills. A lot of them have many more. West Virginia actually has 6 that have been proposed. There are only 2 that are actually making it through up to sort of a voting stage here. Texas has 12 anti-trans bills on the docket this year. So again, this is happening in our communities, this is happening in the world. We need to know the language in order to be able to interact with these types of discussions here. And so to start at the basics of language here, sex, gender, and gender identity. Sex and gender are different. This may be groundbreaking for some of you here. Sex assigned at birth, gender is an identity that you hold that is shaped by society here. So acronyms you may see will be in the brackets on the side here, but assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, or intersex. 1 in every 1,500 babies in the United States is born without readily identifiable external genitalia that would tell you, hooray, it's a boy, or hooray, it's a girl here. So this is not a tiny number. I think the parallel is this is about the same percent of people who are redheaded in society. Gender identity then is how you personally identify with gender. Cisgender and transgender are sort of the 2 sides of the coin. And I'll show you in the blank space all of the other, or a bunch of the other ones that we can have as well. But a cis man or a cis woman, cisgender means that you identify with the sex you were assigned at birth. Transgender means you identify usually with the other one. So if you were assigned male at birth, you identify as female, and vice versa. As I'll talk in a second, trans can also be a big umbrella, which may come into play here. And symbols and flags, if you've ever seen a Pride celebration, you know that there are flags for everything. At Pride, the top one here is transgender, and the symbol then that we use for transgender. 2 of the big gender neutral or non-binary identities, ones that are not assigned male or female, are genderqueer and non-binary. Non-binary hyphenated not. Non-binary often uses NB for non-binary, or saying it out NB there. And again, those are the next 2 flags down here on the side. These are people that don't identify strictly as male or female. Other ways that we can talk about gender identity, gender fluid, people who move between or across or around of these different concepts of gender, agender, bigender, trigender, pangender, lots of different ways. Again, if you know your things, none, one, or none, two, three, and all across the spectrum there. And one other term that I would have you remember here is demi, so kind of. And demi boy, demi girl, demi man, demi woman, someone that identifies mostly with one of those identities, but it's loose there. So again, sex and gender identity, different pieces. The gender binary then talks about these as one or the other. You're either male or you're female. And again, this comes from deep cultural understanding here and sort of societal pressures we've created in many ways. A binary that's very strict. As we know, women have a lot of things in common with men. Men have a lot of things in common with women. So to distinctly separate them is probably not accurate or terribly helpful. But when you talk about transgender folks, then on the binary, you're talking about going from one of these to the other. And we always use the destination here as the descriptor. So a trans woman is someone who was assigned male at birth, but transitions to female. And on the flip side, trans men are people who are assigned female at birth, but transition to male. Okay. And so again, this is a binary concept here, that you're moving from one to the other, and that there are distinct pieces. This doesn't have to be the case. So gender identity, as I said, doesn't just have to be cisgender or transgender. You can also have things in the middle. And so with my very, very poor PowerPoint graphics here, putting these on a spectrum, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, these are folks that find themselves somewhere in the middle or transversing sort of the spectrum between these two main points. And others would say a spectrum itself is too narrow. Maybe you should use something like this where you're just exploding gender in the middle. I saw a cartoon the other day that was just taking the gender binary and throwing it in the trash can and lighting it on fire. That can be a perception of this non-binary identities as well here. So when you move from one or the other to this spectrum and lots of identities existing, we get a lot more variance here. So what we end up with in many cases are terms that are umbrella terms. So transgender, genderqueer, non-binary. The cartoon on the side here is by Melanie Gilman, who is a non-binary sequential artist, graphic novelist, and instructor. They teach up in Ohio here. But their concept here is basically that the spectrum isn't necessarily accurate. And actually, I love the bottom right-hand corner here of their conceptualization of gender as constellations. And I think that's really helpful in many ways, that some people, cisgender men, identify very closely with our traditional idea of maleness, and some are very loosely associated, but they still identify as men there. Same with women, and again, non-binary somewhere around, about, and in between. So transgender can refer to the binary. It can also refer to anyone whose gender identity doesn't conform to what they were assigned at birth. So non-binary people can identify as transgender. Some do, some don't. And ultimately, the choice here is up to whoever's using the term. So there are plenty of people who identify as trans non-binary. There are some that would say I'm non-binary, but I'm absolutely not trans. And there's some in the trans community that also view this as a binary choice and would say, no, non-binary doesn't fit within our scope. It's either one or the other there. So, yeah. To step here to other cultures. So I mentioned that Western culture, Christian culture tends to be very binary in its thinking. Other indigenous cultures around the world, there are hundreds of them that have different concepts of gender that are not strictly binary. And the one that we encounter the most often in the United States and in North America will be the TwoSpirit identification. As you can see here from the Two-Spirit Society of Denver, it's really, Two-Spirit celebrates the fact that there are people who are gender nonconforming that exist outside the gender binary within these cultures. Two-Spirit, the name itself, actually comes out of a direct decision by Indigenous communities to find some umbrella term to talk about this variety of more than two gender sort of societies here. So some Indigenous tribes have 4 genders, some have 5, some have 3. But the First Nations and Native Americans communities wanted a way to be able to push back against this, to talk about it sort of universally here. And so two-gender was the term, or two-spirit was the term that we came up with there. If you ever see the LGBTQ acronym here with the number 2 in it, what it is referencing is two-spirit. And sometimes it will have 2S on there, sometimes it will just be a 2 up by itself. But that's what we're coming up with. Two-spirit is reserved to Native peoples. So non-Native, non-Indigenous people cannot have this title. It will not be an identity. Not all two-spirit people identify with then the LGBTQ acronyms that you use in the broader white community there. So while you may look at it and say, well, that's trans or that's non-binary, they may not use that identity as well. Two-spirit is a distinct feature there. Again, each tribe will have its own actual terms for these different genders, but two-spirit becomes the umbrella term that you can use when confronting sort of outside society there. And again, two-spirit people in these cultures are revered. It's an honor and a privilege for your society to have someone that understands these different gendered experiences here. They allow you and enrich your community. So some other terms, gender expression here. Gender expression is how you present your gender. And so this can be both cis and trans, this can be non-binary, this can apply to everybody. We have expectations about what gendered clothing looks like, what we're supposed to wear or not. So descriptions here that deal with this: masculine, feminine, trans masc or trans femme, one that identifies with something that is on the other side of there. Masc of center, femme of center is a way to describe people's presentation. And we've got, of course, all kinds of words then, both for AMAB, assigned male at birth, and AFAB people about how this works. Some of these have been viewed as slurs over time. I am an AFAB person, and I was talking to one of my colleagues one time, and they said, well, you know, sort of like, I like sports, I like doing those outdoorsy things. Well, how do you, like, what identified you? And it's like, oh, tomboy worked really well, like, as a kid. And they said, well, wasn't that like meant to be derogatory or something? Like, it might have been, but I liked it. So I don't know what to tell you there. So that was one that always made sense to me. Gender non-conforming people are people who do not conform with the traditional expectations of gender. And of course, there are all kinds of things that give us this traditional representation of what gender is supposed to be. What toys do you play with, and do you like makeup, and what clothes do you wear, and what hobbies do you have, and what cars do you drive? There's so many things that we gender in society. How do you interact with people? Again, being really in somebody's face is deemed a really good thing for men, and it's deemed a really terrible thing for women. And so gender non-conforming people are ones who break that mold. A lot of people who use the idea of gender non-conforming to describe themselves identify as cis. So someone who is assigned female at birth, identifies as a woman, but doesn't conform to the expectations of what woman means there in society. So NB people, trans people can also use this, but it's very often used by cisgender people to be able to talk about their own experiences, again, with the constellations of being further from maybe the center identity of male or female there. Within gender expression, you should talk about passing and erasure. So again, there are expectations for what you should be in society. There's a normative expectation of what that's going to be. And if you are able to basically look like and act like the people, the norm there, you are passing. So cis passing has to do with gender, straight passing has to do with sexual orientation. There is safety in being able to pass there. With transgender folks being able to go to the bathroom without being harassed depends on whether or not you pass there. This also means, though, that there's an incredible amount of erasure that happens. That because you don't see these people, because you can't know that they are trans or know that they are LGB of some variety there, you don't think they exist. And the reality for a lot of us is that we think we live in a circle that doesn't have these folks, when really we do. But they are just passing and won't tell us because they're afraid of what will happen if they identify there. So with gender expression, we also have a couple other terms that have to do with performing gender. So cross-dressing is really an umbrella term here. And as I'll mention in just a second, it's really losing some of its relevance as we go. But anyone who's seen RuPaul's Drag Race knows drag queens, drag kings, this is absolutely performance for entertainment of gender there. So cross-dressing itself, again, historically, there was a fair amount of cross-dressing, particularly of women dressing as men in order to get jobs, in order to have security in society. As we have expanded the description or the idea of gender expression, the usefulness of the term cross-dressing changes, right? So if my preferring to wear slacks and button-up shirts is really just an expression of my gender identity, it's not cross-dressing anymore. So while there still is this performative cross-dressing that happens, it does not refer to just people who dress in the clothes of what's traditionally deemed the other sex there. So gender expression, again, how you actually perform and do gender out in the world there. That expression may not match your gender identity. Again, with regards to passing here, there are plenty of people who say, I may feel trans inside, but if I go outside trans, I'm going to be harassed, I'm going to be beaten up, I'm going to face some real consequences here. I'll be kicked out of my home, lose my job. So expression may not correlate ultimately with identity. Sexual orientation, I have to put this in here, but it's going to be a quick sort of side note. Gender expression and gender identity are not sexual orientation. And so that's the real point. I could probably stop there, but I might as well give you a couple terms on the rest of it. The reason why you would talk about sexual orientation in a talk on gender identity is ultimately that we define someone's sexual orientation based on the gender of them and the gender of the people that they love. And so it becomes a question of gender, even if, again, gender expression in and of itself is not a good indicator of sexuality for people. So don't assume there. Sexuality, we should talk about the idea that sexual attraction is not the same as romantic attraction. Sexual attraction is obviously who you want to have sex with. Emotional attraction is who you want to spend time with. Again, in Western society, we prioritize sexual attraction as the type of attraction. In other communities, and maybe even in your own lives, you know what? Good friends are much better than good partners. I don't need partners, I need friends. Here, an emotional attraction, people you want to be with and spend time with. So when you talk about sexuality and romantic attraction, there are terms for both of them. And so again, we underestimate the value. We kind of mock bromances. These are important relationships in people's lives. About platonic life partners. You can have a long committed relationship with somebody that you're not having sex with. Again, just like we had with gender identity, there are all types of sexual orientation here. You can have no sexual attraction to anybody. This is not a disease or an illness. This is simply the way some people are. Allosexual is the norm here, people who do experience sexual attraction. Homosexual, heterosexual, we always use the terms in the brackets here. So you are straight or you are gay is a wide term here, gay or lesbian. Again, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, different ways to experience sexuality with regards to gender. Pansexual, folks are ones who it's usually meant to be people who are sexually attracted people regardless of gender. Omnisexual, attracted to people of all genders. Again, pansexual is much more common as a term here for people with partners of multiple genders. Demi, again, kind of sexual attraction. And again, romantic, we have the same sort of set of terms here. Again, if you're dipping your toe into this area, there's just a lot that we can go on with here. Back to gender identity with regards to transitioning and trans folks, couple starter points. There is no one way to transition. There's no right way for someone to transition. And not all trans people want to or are able to transition there. There are a lot of costs that go into that. And again, safety concerns and other issues there. Just because someone doesn't physically transition doesn't mean they can't identify as trans. And not everybody who takes steps to transition, what we would consider transition, is trans. I've seen a big push for double mastectomies for cisgender women. Like, if you don't want breasts, you shouldn't have to have them. And that doesn't make you trans. That should just be a thing there. You don't have to identify as trans there. So transition or not to transition, lots of different things that go into this. Again, safety, money is a huge part of it. Insurance often doesn't cover transition-related care. In West Virginia, it does not. PEIA, which is what all of us at university have, explicitly says it will not cover things related to gender dysphoria here. There was a lawsuit that was brought up on that, so that may be challenged, but that's the standard at this point. Why transition? Dysphoria is the term that you should know with regards to transition. Dysphoria is the feeling that your gender does not match your body, or that you want to diminish some of the characteristics of your body that identify you as male or female. There are different ways to transition. We tend to focus on surgical transition as the way, but there's a whole host of things that can happen outside of surgery. And in fact, if you are, again, in your classrooms, in your clubs, social transitioning is what you're going to encounter here. You have no business asking about the physical part. But socially, this is where you need to step up there. So socially transition means to live as your true gender identity. And this includes names, this includes pronouns, this includes clothing choices. A dead name is the name that a person does not use anymore. Never, ever, ever use someone's dead name. It is wildly just beyond disrespectful and harmful, ultimately, as they are leaving that identity behind there. So many people and many trans-identified people will just transition socially. That is enough for them to alleviate that dysphoria and to live as themselves. Again, physically, you can also transition, but there are a lot of ways that you can transition not medically to, again, minimize gender and sexual characteristics here. And then there are the surgical or medical transition types of things. This is the short version. Actually, the WVU Center, their surgical center, had a really great, like, Trans 101 transitioning seminar last semester. So hormones, puberty blockers are the big thing that's in the news with regards to limiting healthcare for transgender kids. These are simply things that stop the estrogen or the testosterone from hitting you at puberty to, again, minimize the physical changes that would have come about with transition. Hormones, and then gender confirmation surgery as a whole. So again, this is a decision that people have to make on their own. This is a decision that unfortunately often comes down to money or safety or availability sort of questions here. And again, outside of the social transition piece, you have no business asking anybody about the physical transition parts there, or their partners or any, just no. Pronouns. So again, pronouns are probably the place, honestly, where most of us will interact with gender diversity. This is how, of course, you're referred to indirectly. If you don't know how to refer to someone, you can always just use their name. There's no reason you have to use a pronoun at all there. Just as a note here, when we started talking about pronouns, the question was, what were your preferred pronouns? ask what pronouns someone uses, not which ones they prefer. Prefer means that it's just sort of a choice and you can take it or leave it. Which ones do you use? Which ones do you want me to use there? I will note that there is some situational usage there. So someone may come to you and say, I think I'm non-binary. I would like to use they, them pronouns, but I'm not really comfortable doing that like in front of a classroom. So when we talk, or when you talk about, can you use them there, but not someplace else? This has been particularly true for younger students, K through 12 kind of students. What do you want me to use with you in class versus what do you want me to use when I talk to your parents? Are you out to your parents or not? So be aware that there may be different pronouns of choice. On the binary, we have the he, him, her, he, him, his, and she, her, hers. But there are a lot of non-binary pronouns that are out there. And these also get the name now of neo-pronouns. They, them, their is by far the most common non-binary pronoun and gender-neutral pronoun. It is the good starter pronoun for everything. And one of the things I'm going to recommend in a second is if you don't assume someone's gender and always start with they. Again, this may be strange when you start, but it's the best way to ensure that you're not misgendering somebody. Z here, EM, ZZM, Fay, fair is becoming more common here. So there are a lot of choices out there. And so if you allow someone to tell you their pronouns, once they do, make sure you use them. Some key things that come up when I talk about pronouns are some holdups, some questions here. How do you know? Ask, observe, which ones do they use? A lot of people that are genderqueer or non-binary will actually put pronoun pins out there. So they'll have something. Ask politely, what pronouns do you use? Again, if you start with they and someone says, well, I use she. Okay, great, now you know. There. If you start with she and they say, I really use they, use they. Again, it's not overly tough there. And again, once you're told, make sure you use it. Plenty of I don't want to, it's weird, I don't know if I can do that. It's really different. Suck it up is the lesson there. This isn't your choice, ultimately. And I just would beg you to think about what would happen if you identify as a woman and someone called you him all day long. It would be incredibly disruptive to you. It would be really, really awkward. It would be just wrong. So just don't do that to somebody else there. Again, you don't get to decide that, and intentionally misgendering someone is incredibly harmful, ultimately. So don't do that. And again, in the case of a system like WVU, where we've got protections, you'll get fired if you misgender people consistently. That is not your prerogative to do that. Why display my pronouns if they're obvious? So again, the norm is male and female, she and he. So why put them out there if you're a cisgender person? It clarifies this for other people. Again, if you're working with the assumption that we're going to go with they and gender neutrality from the start, this allows someone to know what you would choose. It also makes your respect of other people's pronouns really clear. It creates an environment and an atmosphere in which people will be willing to talk about their pronouns. I don't have to pass and just use the binary ones because people are going to be willing to listen to it there. I went to a conference for the American Political Science Association where they actually had pins. It was the first professional conference I've ever been at where they had pronoun pins, and it was awesome. And it really then created that place where you said, you know what? If I identify as they, them, I can use they, them because everybody else recognizes that we need to state our pronouns too. What if you get it wrong? Again, this is centering yourself, so don't get your pain at getting something wrong is not a valid reason to make someone else's life miserable. I apologize, briefly apologize. You don't need to fall on your face and bow down for this. Sorry, you're right. They did this. Just move on there. And an interesting exercise that I heard the other day that I find really effective here is you are, especially if you're someone that you know, you are changing something. You're changing your muscle memory and the pathways in your brain to do something else when you see that person. So the 3-sentence exercise is really helpful. If you find yourself misgendering someone, every time that happens, in your head, say 3 sentences using the correct pronouns. So if I wanted you to use they pronouns for me, Dr. Kent, they teach political science. They really like pizza. Their office is over in the classroom building. Just really sort of simple things, but it reiterates this sort of concept and helps you retrain your brain in a sense there. So again, pronouns are probably the place again where we're going to see the most interaction here in language. So some best practices here. Don't assume gender. Again, just because it's the norm in society doesn't mean that it is what everybody will have. And there are plenty of non-binary people who are not androgynous. There are femme non-binary people, there are masculine non-binary people. And if you assume that just because you look like a man, you're going to be a man, you might be wrong there. Use gender neutral language until you know differently. So start with the default of gender neutrality and then work to the specific ones. And I've got a list over on the side there. It was cute graphic, but there's all kinds of terms that we can use for gender neutral pieces here. So people, humans, pals. In a group setting, you should always use gender neutral language because you do not know, even in this classroom I'm sitting with right now, if someone in here is non-binary or not, or is genderqueer or not. And having moved from a state that did not use y'all regularly, I am totally enamored with the term y'all. It is a fantastic gender neutral term here. And it's just something. So yeah, you can see all the ones over on the side. You know, everyone, people, exalted guests, scholars, happy people. There's all different kinds of ways. We can use gender neutral language, but try to pull the gender out of your language. Create space for authentic gender expression. So again, provide your pronouns regularly, habitually. I would encourage faculty, when you start your class, introduce that every time. I'm Dr. Andi Kent, I use she and they pronouns. Use them all the time. And then again, that just creates an opening here where if a student does use non-binary pronouns or other pronouns or is transgender, they say, oh, okay, they'll get it. I can talk to them about this and they will follow through with that. If you can ask for pronouns and chosen names, I think a lot of us do this already. Do you go by a nickname? And this is very common. Joshua's like to be called Josh. There's no reason you can't make the same accommodations for non-binary or transgender folks there. Maybe not in a full group though. There's a lot of discussion about, do you do a pronoun circle where everybody goes around the room and says their pronouns? You're putting people on the spot there in a way that can make people really, really uncomfortable. But if you do sort of an intro survey for your students, put a place on there, ask them, what are your pronouns? And how would you like me to refer to you there? The last two I've got needing start on here. Think really hard about when we ask for gender. So if you're creating a form that needs to know gender, offer an alternative to male and female. Again, if you're dealing with someone who's non-binary, you're basically asking them to lie, to hedge. Not either, but I'm closest to this. There's no reason to do that. And again, really think about when do you need to know someone's gender or not. There can absolutely be circumstances where you do need to know this. But there are plenty of times where we ask for gender where it's really not important to the discussion. Then maybe just don't ask. The other one would be if you're making groups. So if you're dividing the class, guys on one side, girls on the other, your NB students are going, damn, okay, I guess, again, I'll hedge and I'll go this way or that way. Why are you using that as the dividing factor? And at least think about what you will choose there. Again, if you're going to do guys on one side, girls on the other, and say non-binary folks, take your pick. Just make that part of the discussion there. Make that part of the description about how you're dividing those different groups there. So those are my overall best practices pieces. Whoo-wee. Conclusions here. Again, sex and gender are different. Individuals get to decide where they fall on these pieces. For some people, your gender identity is going to be beyond the binary there. Gender identity, sexual orientation, these can change. And so don't be terribly surprised. If someone says, I would prefer to go by this now, or I want to use these, okay, cool. But that's all you need to do as a supportive person. And again, allyship is huge here. So transgender folks, gender nonconforming, non-binary folks make up a small portion of of society overall. Most of you don't fall into those categories, but we really need good allies with what's going on in the world here. So as I was putting this together a couple times, I've got a whole bunch of different references at this point. This is something I've read up on a lot. These are all articles. Some of them are ones that I cited in the piece. Other ones are just good sort of expansions on these topics. There's lots and lots of books out there nowadays, some really good ones. I highly recommend, and I don't know, maybe we can start a thing on campus. Every department should have a quick and easy guide to they, them pronouns. It's a graphic novel. It's really short. It's like $6. But it's delightful, and it's written by a non-binary graphic novelist and in co-authoring with a cisgender guy who wants to introduce non-binariness into his office. So again, lots of them, some really great reading lists that are out there. There are tons of fiction. That's been one of the fun parts about being clued into the LGBTQ sort of section of fiction. There are a lot of awesome books, young adult books, little kids books that talk about these concepts. It Feels Good to Be Yourself is literally like a picture book. This is Johnny. He doesn't identify as a girl or a boy. He's called non-binary. You're like, brilliant. One more piece, LGBTQ organizations as a whole. We've got local ones, we've got statewide organizations, you've got regional ones, there's national organizations. If you're looking to be an ally here, where to spend some time, where to spend some money, who to follow on Twitter to know what kind of bills are being passed right now. These are organizations I would recommend there. And I have no idea how long I took. Oh, pretty good.
So thank you, Dr. Kent. You crammed a lot in 54 minutes. Thank you. I'll be emailing out the presentation to everyone.
Okay.
Everybody gets a copy. If you have the contact, and thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all for giving me your very nice Tuesday afternoon. Listen to this.